That's what I'm preaching about today, based on the sermon title. Huh? What is the sermon title? Who's writing their bulletin? Eager to give. Now, I want to calm you down right away. I'm not just talking about money. Although I will talk about money, but not just about money. But what I want to talk about is not so much the giving, although that's important, but I want to talk about the eagerness. Let's give the background, what some call the backstory, if you will, of this passage from 2 Corinthians that Dan read for us. Paul is talking about a commitment that the Corinthian Christians made to support the Jerusalem church in a time of financial need and hardship. Now, the backstory is, of course, that the Jerusalem church is the mother church, right? It's the church of Jesus and the apostles. And the Jerusalem church, of course, is in Jerusalem. That's why it's called the Jerusalem church. Corinth is one of the leading centers of the Roman world. And Corinth's church is not a Jewish church, not a Jewish Christian church, but it is a Gentile church. And it is a church that was established by Paul. And Paul is kind of like the church father, if you will. Now, Paul, of course, didn't stay in any single place for too long, and he established many churches. And he continued to communicate through his letters with churches in Corinth and Ephesus and Philippi and Colossae. What other churches do we have listed there in those letters of Paul? Galatia. Yeah, there was a church in Galatia. Oh yeah, one in Rome too. Although he didn't found that one. He wrote to that one, he didn't found it. But anyway, the backstory is that the world outside of Jerusalem in Paul's time had many opportunities. And Corinth was a bustling city. We couldn't quite say it could be the New York City of its day, because that title would go to Rome itself. But it was a big city. Maybe we could say it was, like San Francisco or LA. Certainly better than Portland for you Oregonians in the audience. But it was a big, prosperous city. And the church in Jerusalem, of course, was increasingly under pressure and persecution, because as this thing, this movement called Christianity grew, it became increasingly Gentile. And the original Jewish Christian church found itself increasingly isolated, and particularly in Jerusalem itself. So, things were tight in the Jerusalem church. And Paul, as he traveled around, was taking up a collection. That's what the biblical scholars call it. If you have a study Bible, you'll find little notes about the collection, always in quotation marks. And various churches, Paul would say, if you possibly can, could you contribute to a collection to help the mother church back in Jerusalem? And so any number of churches did so. And Paul mentions in several of his letters the response of various communities. Like, for instance, he really praises the Philippians for their contribution. Now he's talking to the church in Corinth. And he's saying to them, the last time I was here, a year ago, you promised that you would contribute to this. And now the time has come to follow through on your promise. So, the background of this is that the Corinthian church had made a commitment. And Paul is calling on them to fulfill their commitment. But this is the part I want to focus on today. He's not just calling them to fulfill their commitment. It's not like, not that anybody in our church would do that, I hope. But it's not like somebody calling you up from the finance committee saying, hey, didn't you promise to give us money and you haven't given it to us yet? And why? Well, that's not what Paul was about. He wasn't like, come on, pay up. You said you would give it. No. He says, I want you to have an eagerness to give. Not because you said you would, but because you have an opportunity to help. See, this is where we need to find ourselves as the Church of Jesus Christ. We need to find ourselves eager to give, not just financially, but of our talents and our time and our energy, so that God can accomplish God's purposes. If we give generously, but not eagerly, the gift is diminished. And we build up within ourselves a resentment. I don't want to sound ridiculously stupid here, but do we all understand what resentment is? I want you to really understand what resentment is. Not just the word. I mean, sure, you know what the word means. But resentment is like the solid foundation of hate and prejudice. You understand what I mean? It is like pouring the cement that allows us to build all the wrong kinds of buildings with our Christian life. There are many people who, with good reason, find the church a difficult place to go to find God. Did you know that? Read Time Magazine or Newsweek or U.S. News and World Report. Read some of the articles where they do these surveys about how that fewer people claim to be Christian and fewer people go to church. And some of the things you'll hear them saying are people saying, well, I believe in God. I even believe that Jesus is the Son of God. But, I don't find the church helpful. You know why? Because in a lot of churches, they've laid a foundation of resentment. And they don't love sinners. They say they do, but they don't. They don't want the sinners in their church. They don't want them to come to their church to be converted and receive new life. You know what I mean? Conversion is a messy business. True conversion of those who are truly in need of the gospel makes us uncomfortable. I was having this discussion in a way. Do I really want to talk about that or not? Sometimes it's hard to decide what to talk about. Because some things that happen are not indicative of who we are. But they send a message nonetheless that others believe. Paul wants the Corinthians and us to understand that we are privileged to have the opportunity to do anything for God. Do you understand that? We are privileged. It's not our right. None of us deserves the right to be here. But God's grace invites us none the same. And God's grace invites not just you and me, but all of those folks that many people would look at strangely if they came and sat in our midst.